And welcome back to ABC6 News on the Record. I'm your host, Mark Curtis. We're talking with the Republican candidates for Congressional District 1 in Rhode Island, the seat currently occupied by Democrat David Cicilline. We heard from Cormac Lidge. Time now to meet his opponent, Stan Tran. Good to have you here, Stan.
Thank you for having me here.
Welcome to On the Record. Well, you're running for Congress, and so people don't know much about you. They don't know much about the other candidates, so this is your time to introduce yourself. Who's Stan Tran? Give us a little snapshot of your life and what brings you to this moment in time to run for Congress.
So my name is Stan Tran. I'm a medical student at Brown University, and I'm in my last year of studies, and I've decided to run for Congress. So I had no political ambition until I got to medical school, and I realized that the things I want to address, I can't address as a physician. That I need to step outside from my role as a doctor and address it through politics.
It's fascinating because we have a lot of doctors in Congress now, probably more physicians than I think we've ever had. And you see a lot of them serving at the state level too.
Right.
And I think a lot of this has been driven by health care reform and now Obamacare and so forth. Was there something you saw in the president's policies regarding medical care or Obamacare that said, hey, I need to step in and exert my influence on this, my knowledge?
It wasn't what the president passed. It's the state of our health care. It's been this way for the last decade or 2 decades. For example, patients often can't afford the medication, and so they cut their pills in half or don't take their pills. And so they're not getting the standard of care that they deserve. And the way we're trained in medical school, we're not trained to deal with that problem. We're told to refer that patient to the social worker and that they'll take care of it. Well, I feel that's my problem as a physician if my patients can't get the care that they deserve. And to lower the cost of prescription medication is something I can't do within the field of medicine, but it's something I can address in Congress. As Americans, we pay the most for prescription medication by far of any country, and that can change.
So would you repeal Obamacare? Would you modify it? What would you do with it as a health care delivery system, and especially trying to address people that didn't have medical care and find something for them instead of this?
So the one thing Obamacare did well was to give people coverage.
Okay.
Before Obamacare passed, healthcare was too expensive, and today is still too expensive. Obama promised to lower the cost of healthcare, and that hasn't happened. And that's by far the largest problem. If healthcare was affordable, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. People get what they needed, and it's done. So I have 4 or 5 big ideas that can help lower the cost of healthcare, and they're on my website.
Share a couple of them.
Great.
Just give us the highlights.
Sure. So forcing hospitals to publish prices of the procedures they provide and data on outcome. So as a consumer, I want choice. And with the 8 different hospitals around here, I want to know who can do it best and who can do it cheapest. We don't have that data.
So you create some competition.
Right, right. Right now there's supposedly competition, but if you don't know what you're getting, that's not real competition.
Let's talk about the overall economy, and certainly healthcare is a big part of the economy. It's been the part that's been the most inflationary part of an economy that really hasn't had much inflation in 20 years.
Right.
What would you do about the rest of the economy? Would you cut taxes? How would you create jobs? I mean, we're in the state with the largest unemployment rate in the country for years.
So you're absolutely right that the healthcare is tied to the economy, and people often see those two things as separate. But the cost of healthcare is so high in this country that it increases the cost of labor. When you go out and you buy a GM car, you spend more money towards the steel in that car when you buy a car. You spend more money towards the workers' health care than towards the steel in that car. So this is the reason why companies are moving to other countries where the cost of health care is less. Right? So if we can get the cost down, that's going to help. A lot of the conflicts between unions and management is over who's going to pay for the cost of health care, because it goes up every year, and the management wants the employees to pay for it, and employees can't afford to. So if we can solve the cost of health care, that's really going to solve the labor issue. It's going to make labor less expensive and bring companies back. The other part to the economy is having vocational training in high school. I think the last 1 or 2 decades we've pushed out all the vocational training because we want kids to go to college. And that's great if they graduate, but the reality of the situation in this state is most kids who go to college drop out in the first year and don't come back. So we fail these kids. They are in debt, and they have no job potential, and they have no other backup training.
You know, it's an interesting thing. The other day I was at New England Tech, and they have this new program called SAMI, which is to help train local Rhode Island workers to become welders and shipbuilders and other trades in the maritime industry, because we have this $18 billion contract coming to Swanson, Quonset to build the submarines. What do we do beyond that? I mean, that seems like a start, but what do we do beyond that to get more people back to work in the state?
So the issue that people aren't talking about, politicians aren't talking about, is going back and changing our high school curriculum. all the politicians who have talked about vocational training have talked about it as something you go to after high school. Like instead of going to college, you go to vocational training. The problem today is that all the high school teachers and counselors are pushing kids to go to college because the schools are being graded based on how many students go to a four-year college, indirectly through grants like Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind, and that needs to change.
And are we not preparing? I mean, we have a lot of college graduates who are unemployed,
right.
And then you have a company with a huge contract that needs welders, and they say, well, we can't find enough people in this area to build submarines, so we're going to bring workers in from Maine or Pennsylvania. It just seems like there's a weird imbalance in the system in terms of supply and demand of workers for certain jobs in the economy.
Absolutely, and I think the reason why we have a gluttony of people who graduate from college and can't find jobs, and a deficit of people with the skills that we need, is because of this influence over high schools of the federal government telling high schools what to do and sending their kids to college. And I think that needs to change.
We may come back to some domestic issues if we have time, but let's talk international issues. I don't remember a time we've had as many international hotspots and crises on the globe at one time. And let's start at our southern border. We have all these immigrant children, unaccompanied children being dumped at the border, crossing into the country illegally. What should the United States do about the immigration problem as a whole, but more specifically about caring for those children or getting them back to their homeland? I mean, it's a mess.
Right. So America is a nation built on immigrants. I think immigration is great, but that's legal immigrants. For example, in this city, we have foreign students that come and study at Johnson & Wales. They live here in Rhode Island province for 4 years. Some of them are entrepreneurial and want to start a business. Some of those ideas have the potential to create jobs here in this state. But those students can't stay. They'll apply for a visa, but they won't get it because of the influx of illegal immigrants. So we want more legal immigrants. We want those people to stay and give them a chance at creating jobs. But the illegal immigration is hurting that. So everyone needs to do it legally, go through the process, fill out the paperwork, and get it approved. And the first step towards doing that is securing the border, so we stop this influx of illegal immigrants.
But if you secure the border tomorrow and you stop all the illegals from coming in, you still have, in this current crisis, as many as 80,000 children. Do you just send them back? And that's not an easy process. There's legal guarantees and steps they have to go through.
Right.
Do you bring some of them to Rhode Island or Massachusetts temporarily to be cared for? How do we deal with that part of it?
I mean, I think we need to send those kids back to where they came from. And we need to streamline the process for how that works. Right now, I think the way it's set up right now will take years for them to go through all the legal, there are not enough immigration judges to make this happen. We need to change that, to streamline that, to make it faster.
If the governor of Rhode Island gets a call from President Obama and says, can you take 1,000 or 2,000 of these kids maybe for 4 to 6 months, what should the governor say and why?
I think our system is stretched as is, and unless the government's going to give us, the federal government's going to give us money to take those kids, in which case we can look at whether we can afford to do so. If they're not going to give us money to take care of those 1,000 children, we can't afford to do that in the state.
It's an important point, because the Mariel boat lift, which is very similar to this crisis back in the 1980s, most of the states were not reimbursed for the money they spent caring for Cuban refugees. Let's talk about some of the other international crises. Of course, we have this horrendous tragedy of the Malaysian jetliner shot down over Ukraine. What should the United States response be to Vladimir Putin if Russians are indeed responsible for at least some of this or providing the weapons?
So we need to be sure about what's happened, but I think all the evidence so far has pointed to Russia as being the people who supplied the surface-to-air missiles that downed this jetliner. If Russia did supply that, they're responsible. I mean, they're partly responsible, mostly responsible for this. It's like if you give a weapon to a child and the child goes out and hurts somebody, as a parent or as a provider of that weapon, you're responsible. So I'm holding Russia and Vladimir Putin in this case responsible.
Now, prior to this, President Obama had already issued some sanctions because there's been some other problems with Crimea and Ukraine and so forth. Should these sanctions be increased? Should the European Union be brought into the sanctions?
Yes.
What do we do to ratchet up the pressure on Putin?
So I think now with this downing of the jetliner, international opinion is turning against Russia. And so that gives us more leverage to strengthen the sanctions on Russia. Not just us, but everyone. I mean, let's say if the whole world gets involved and agrees to these sanctions and tightens it down, Russia effectively is isolated and has no market outside of its country, and that's going to be devastating. So I think we have a lot of potential power to work with other people to make this happen.
Is there any role for the military putting, troops on the ground in a nearby country or missiles on the ground in a nearby country and saying, don't do this again? I mean, does the U.S. need to be firmer in terms of a military response to this, or is it the fact that there's really no stomach for another military conflict right now in this country?
So I think the situation in Ukraine is important to look at history and understand that that country has always been conflicted between the West and Russia because of its location. During World War I and World War II, parts of Ukraine, during World War II, for example, parts of Ukraine were with the Nazis because the Nazis were fighting Stalin, and parts of the Ukrainians were on the Russian side. And so for hundreds of years, they've been split between these two sides, and today, the start of this conflict was the same reason, right? You had the protests, pro-EU protests, but the president, the prime minister wanted to go be more allied with Russia, and so that led to this conflict. And the important thing here to understand is that an armed intervention isn't going to solve that root cause, is that that country, the people of Ukraine are conflicted between the two sides.
We have just 2 minutes and a lot of other stuff to get to. Let's move to Iraq. Did we leave that country too soon? I know that regardless of whether we should have been involved in the first place, the country we helped build in Iraq is all of a sudden collapsing under the weight of a likely civil war. What should we do?
Our vision of Iraq does not match their vision, and this is where the problem is. We want a pluralistic, democratic Iraq where all the different factions, the Shiites, the Shiites, the Kurds, are working together. Right. And the prime minister, who's a Shiite because they make the majority of the people there, he's using his power to marginalize the other factions. And people aren't working together, and the country is collapsing as we see today. If we had stayed in Iraq for longer, we would have delayed this, but we would not have solved the problem, which is the lack of working together. So I think this conflict is unfortunate, but it gives us the leverage to say, hey, look, we're here to help you if you can work together. So you have to come up with a power-sharing agreement that all the parties are happy with, and that's going to make for a stable Iraq. So until their vision of Iraq, a pluralistic, democratic Iraq, matches our vision, I don't think we should be helping them.
All right, we have a minute left. I want you to be able to sum up to people what you're about, why you're running, and why should they go into the voting booth and pull the lever for Stan Tran next time around.
So I think I encourage people to look at my ideas. I think my ideas are original.
Mention your website if you need to.
Absolutely. So it's www.stantran.us. Okay. Easy website to go to. It's easy to navigate, and I wrote all those positions myself. And these
30 seconds.
Original positions aren't Democratic or Republican. They're original practical ideas that can solve problems. And I think this is what we need today in Congress, someone who can make the Republicans and Democrats work together based on practical ideas.
All right, Stan Tran, thanks for joining us, Republican candidate for Congress in the 1st Congressional District. We hope you eventually finish medical school. If you're not successful, we'll hear from you again, I'm sure. Good luck to you on primary election day. The primary is September 9th. Thanks for joining us here on ABC6 News on the Record. I'm Mark Curtis. We'll see you back here next time.